Jesus said, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." And over recent weeks, well, actually we've had a gap since we moved in here for 2 weeks, but before that, remember, I started a sermon series called The Way of Love. And we've been thinking about what this command means in practice and following events surrounding the Easter story. Looking at the way, in the first place, how Peter, the disciple, reacted on various occasions. And then contrasting that with the way Jesus acted, with the way Jesus loved. So we've looked at in the upper room when Jesus washed the disciples' feet, a wonderful act of love. But Peter couldn't find it in himself to receive that act of love from Jesus, or found it very difficult. Then we went to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus, with real determination, was praying and trying to keep going on that journey to the cross. Peter had fallen asleep instead of supporting Jesus in prayer there. And then when Jesus was arrested, the amazing way in which he showed love for those around him, his friends, but also his enemies. While Peter's first response was to draw a sword and try to retaliate, which Jesus didn't want. And I must admit, I'm feeling a bit guilty about picking on Peter, every time, constantly pointing the finger at him, who, let's face it, was facing such difficult circumstances. I would not have done any better, any different than Peter, I'm sure. But I do believe that Peter, in part through his own failures and in part seeing how Jesus reacted, did learn the lesson, did learn the way of love. Because in his letters, which were written a long time afterwards, in 1 Peter, Peter says this. He says, "And so your faith and hope are in God. Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for each other, love one another deeply from the heart." Interesting, first of all, that Peter equates obeying the truth with having sincere love for one another. Then he goes on from sincere love to say, love one another deeply. That's in chapter 1 of 1 Peter. In chapter 4 of 1 Peter, he's there again. He says, there's been lots of teaching here, but he says, above all, love each other deeply. Love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. There isn't anything more important for us as Christians than to love one another, once we've established a love for God, of course. There's lots then to contend with, all that doctrine, deciding what we believe about this and that. Lots of do's and don'ts and rights and wrongs to try to get to grips with. And sometimes our views will differ on some of those things. But none of it should cut across this primary command of Jesus to love one another. And that love should manifest itself in a variety of different ways, in many very practical ways. And this is what we've been finding out over in this series of sermons. So where did Peter go wrong this time? Well, as Jesus, having been arrested, is taken to that courtyard of the high priest to be questioned. Quite simply, Peter failed to love by failing on his promise, by failing to keep his promise. He'd been adamant he would never deny Jesus, even if it meant he had to die. That's what he'd said. But how could he know? How could he know how he was going to feel after the shock of seeing Jesus arrested, dragged away by this armed mob, seeing the great Messiah who he believed in helpless in their hands? Jesus had put up no struggle whatsoever, and he'd even rebuked Peter for trying to defend him. Right now, Peter just couldn't understand it all. In a few moments, life had just been turned upside down completely. He was confused and hurt and scared. And so when the challenge came, when the opportunity came to do what he'd promised, he couldn't deliver. He let Jesus down. Now, on the face of it, we might think, well, there's no positive example from Jesus here to contrast that with. But of course, this Easter story that we're immersed in is all about Jesus delivering on a promise, despite the dreadful consequences for him of doing so. Long before this day, Jesus had begun to predict his death. He said he'd come to give his life as a ransom for many on one occasion. And our Bibles tell us that this was a promise made by God even before time began. And God never fails on a promise. We talked about that earlier on. Because failure to keep a promise would be a failure to love. And God never fails to love. Yeah, failing to keep a promise is a failure to love, don't you think? Generally speaking. And something we're all guilty of, I suspect, quite frequently. As I've done this series, I've tried to bring this teaching down to the level of our everyday lives and our lives together as a church family and the way in which we love one another, or fail to sometimes. Which happens, for example, whenever we say we're going to do something for each other and then we don't do it. And we don't do it either because we didn't mean it in the first place, or because we didn't care enough to remember the promise we made. I mean, that's the truth, isn't it? But you know, such seemingly little things are important in our life together as we try to have trust and confidence in each other. And yes, as we seek to obey that command of Jesus to love one another, to put others' interests before our own, to treat others how we'd like them to treat us, which is how Jesus defined love, isn't it? How many times do we say we'll pray for someone and then we forget to do it? Of course, no one will ever know. It's easy to think no more of it, but it matters to God and it should matter to us. It's a symptom of an uncaring attitude, and we should want to do something about that. We should not ignore our failures to do things when we do not do them, or when we treat that lightly. But like Peter, we should show remorse when we fail to do things we've said we'll do, and we should strive to do better in the future. Knowing, of course, yes, that God will forgive us and he'll give us strength to do better in future. So that's one thing to think about, I think, from today's reading. Loving each other means keeping our promises, even the little ones. But there's another side to this, of course, that I want to consider as well. That's how to deal with each other's failure after it's happened. And to do that as well in love. And that failure may be a failure to keep a promise. Oh, it may be because we made a genuine mistake and because we don't always get things right, do we? We try our best to support and love each other and keep those promises, but we're not perfect people. Sometimes it just doesn't work out right. We put our foot in it somehow. Peter got a whole string of things wrong. Some of them we've been going over. And how did Jesus deal with that? We should ask ourselves. How did Jesus deal with Peter's failure? Did he get frustrated? Did he get angry? Did he just get fed up with Peter? I don't think so. It's interesting, if you read this passage from Luke's Gospel, and how he describes things in Luke 22, when we get to the point where Peter's been asked a third time, does he know Jesus? He says this, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. What kind of a look was that? Do you think Jesus was frowning, looking disapproving at Peter or angry with him? I can't think that that's what that look was, not from Jesus. I think as Peter saw that look, well, it was a knowing look, I'm sure. Peter knew that Jesus knew what he had just done, that he'd failed on that promise, but I think it was a look of love as well. And that's what broke Peter down. He just couldn't cope with that. Even when he'd failed Jesus so badly, there was Jesus looking at him with that Jesus look, I guess, that he knew. And then, of course, there's the sequel to this incident, which you may well know. After the resurrection, it's in John chapter 21, when Jesus is talking to Peter, and he asks him 3 times, "Do you love me, Peter?" And 3 times Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And you think, this is a bit repetitive, isn't it? But then you remember Peter denied him 3 times, and now Jesus asks him 3 times to confirm that he still loves him, despite that denial. And it's just a lovely way of forgiving Peter and restoring him after that terrible failure. It always reminds me of that story from Thomas Edison. I've told you it before, haven't I? But it's just a great story. The inventor of the light bulb. His team had spent 24 hours making the prototype of the first light bulb that was going to work. And Edison gave it to a young lad. And he needed to take it up some stairs to where they were going to test it out. And this lad dropped the light bulb and it broke. And the team had to spend another 24 hours creating another one. What did Edison do? He gave the same lad the light bulb. That's just lovely, isn't it? That is a Christ-like reaction, I think. How lovely to do that. So how do we compare with Jesus, or even Edison, when others let us down? And maybe within the church family, how do we react? Is our aim, like that of Jesus, always to restore that person who knows they've failed us, to give them a chance to make amends? Do we continue to trust them like Jesus continued to trust Peter? Do we give them more opportunities to do better? If we love someone, we will never write them off as someone who, they always let you down. Don't bother with them. We'll never do that if we love someone. Instead, we'll be working to build them up again in their confidence and their capabilities, getting alongside them, encouraging them, as Jesus did with Peter. We'll have great patience with them. The kind of patience God has with us when we continually let him down in all kinds of ways. But he keeps loving us. We must remember that as we work together in church life, carrying out all sorts of tasks and activities, the most important thing is often not the end result. We always think it is, but not always. The most important thing is often how we got along with each other along the way to that end result. I do believe that. Did we love each other along the way? That's, I think, what God cares about more than anything. It might mean that some things we see as perhaps failures or are disappointing because they didn't turn out quite as well as we hoped. But in God's eyes, I think it's different. If along the way we maintained and built good relationships with each other, if we had a chance to support and encourage each other, especially when things didn't quite work out, if we had our chance to show our appreciation of other people's efforts, if we showed that forgiveness and that patience with each other, and if we built up that trust with each other, and if those things were evident to those who looked on from the outside, perhaps. Was it a great witness in the way we behaved with each other as we went along? Church life has to be centred first and foremost on our relationships with each other and the way we love one another as we seek to serve the Lord in love. Because that is the primary command of Jesus to us. And that loving one another includes, on the one hand, keeping promises we've made to each other, but also when that doesn't happen, it means reacting in the right way. On the one side, showing genuine remorse when we're the one who's failed, and on the other side, seeking to restore self-worth and confidence and a good relationship with those who have failed us. Jesus says, love one another.